There we go. I need to be able to see both the two screens I'm looking at, so put my glasses back on. Let's see, our guest today, Chris Hebert. Chris is the chief of our Tropics Watch team and the senior hurricane expert at StormGeo. I'll tell you more about Chris in just a moment, but for those of you unfamiliar with StormGeo, let me tell you a little bit about who we are. And I say StormGeo for the first time instead of Impact Weather. Impact Weather has been around since 1996 and in various capacities well before that. But Impact Weather was acquired by StormGeo in 2012, and just last week we fully changed our name to StormGeo. So the beginning of a new chapter for the team here in Houston. That said, let me tell you about StormGeo and StormGeo Onshore. StormGeo Onshore serves as the specialized weather department for hundreds of corporations worldwide, providing tools and services for clients to protect their people, assets, and bottom line when faced with weather-related challenges and threats. As a 24/7, 365-day-a-year, full-service weather department, our team of meteorologists and business continuity experts offer site-specific forecasting and modeling, weather alerts, and business continuity tools that are custom configured for each client we serve. We are proud to help our clients in the oil and gas, energy, banking, insurance, retail, manufacturing, healthcare, petrochemical, hospitality, and the construction industries, as well as many others. The StormGeo Group serves 5 main areas globally: offshore, onshore, media, renewables, and aviation. You can find more information at stormgeo.com. If you have any questions during this presentation, use the questions box under GoToMeeting. We'll also be using Twitter to help you get the most out of this presentation. Just log into your Twitter account and use the hashtag StormWebinar so that you can ask questions, you can share ideas, and discuss the outlook with the Impact Weather team of experts, and I should say StormGeo now, team of experts, and other like-minded professionals. As I mentioned, our presenter today is Chris Hebert. Chris is well known to our clients and is being a bit of a minor celebrity on the Hurricane Conference Tour. That takes place each year at about this time. In fact, we really don't see Chris in the office very much. He's on the road, he's in the air, he's out of the office quite a bit. Chris has been the chief of our Tropics Watch team for quite a number of years. He's our in-house hurricane expert, and he's been with this family from StormGeo to Impact Weather and to Universal Weather and Aviation before that since 1981. Now, before I turn it over to Chris, I'm just going to mention quickly that Chris's microphone is plugged into a soundboard as well as mine, and then the soundboard is plugged into my GoToMeeting, GoToWebinar, Citrix, whatever you want to call it, login. So even though Chris is talking, you're probably going to see my name at the bottom of your screen, so I apologize in advance for any confusion that might create. But Chris, Mr. Hebert, you are ready, is that correct? So I'm going to mute my microphone and turn it over to you.
I am ready, Dave, and it's going to take a little bit of getting used to being StormGeo Meteorologist Chris Hebert. I've been saying Impact Weather Meteorologist Chris Hebert for 20 years now, so hopefully I don't slip up too much. Well, let's take a look first of all, before we get into what we expect for the hurricane season. I want to take a little bit of a look at the rest of the severe weather season, actually going into the fall months. And so far, it's been a rather quiet season. This is the high wind reports from January through the beginning parts of April, and we can see that the 10-year average is that black line here, and we're at well below average. In fact, almost 1,000 wind reports lower than normal for so far this early in the season. And it's very, very quiet spring months, and the reason for that is primarily we haven't had much flow off the Gulf of Mexico over the last 2 or 3 months. In fact, during the month of March, we went all the way till about the last week of March before registering a single tornado across the country. If we take a look at the tornado reports from this year, they're also well below normal. That large black dashed line here is the 10-year average from January through December, and we're well below that, well below any recent year, at least over the last 10 years in terms of tornado activity. So relatively quiet, but it has been getting a little bit more active just over the last few weeks. And I think the primary reason for that is the developing El Nino, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here. The El Nino is causing an increased storm track across the southern U.S., and we're expecting for the next few months all the way through July still enhanced thunderstorms, an enhanced chance of heavy rain and hail across the southern plains over toward the southeastern U.S. And the prime reason, like I said, is the El Nino that's developing. Storm track is shifting a little bit southward across the southern U.S. Those storms are moving across the southern U.S., and that's what's been responsible for the severe thunderstorms of late. I think that same pattern is going to be continuing as we move into the late summer and into early fall. I still think we're going to see an enhanced risk of severe storms and heavy rain, not so much over toward Florida, but more toward the southern plains as we move through August all the way into October. So it is going to be quieter than normal, but we still have to watch across the southern U.S. with that active southern storm track continuing through the summer months. Well, that's a look at the severe weather part of the webinar. Now let's start talking about hurricanes, and that's my specialty. As we look forward toward the 2015 hurricane season, well, what are we expecting? Let's first take a look at what happened last year. Last year, you might remember, was a relatively quiet season. We had only 8 named storms. We had quite a few hurricanes in there, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 hurricanes out of 8 named storms, which is very unusual. Most of the activity was developing north of the Caribbean Sea. We only had 1 tropical storm moving through the eastern Caribbean Sea here. The Gulf was relatively quiet. We had a weak tropical storm move into Mexico. So all in all, not much activity in what we call the main development region between the coast of Africa and through the central Caribbean Sea, much of it north of the Caribbean Sea last year. In fact, it's been very quiet across the United States coastline for the last 10 years in terms of major Category 3, 4, or 5 hurricane impact. The last Category 3 or 4 or 5 hurricane that struck the United States coastline was nearly 10 years ago, the longest period of time on record since the major hurricanes records have been kept. And typically, major hurricanes strike the United States coastline about once every 1.5 to 2 years. So 10 years is a very long time. That last Category 3 or greater hurricane was Wilma, striking South Florida as a large Category 3 on October 24th of 2005. So quite a long time. I know we had Sandy hit the East Coast, but it wasn't even registered as a hurricane when the center made landfall. And we had Isaac a couple of years before that, striking southeast Louisiana as barely a Category 1 hurricane. So not much hurricane activity along the United States coastline of late. What do we expect for 2015? Well, we first have to look at whether or not we're going to have an El Nino developing this year. Last year we talked about El Nino. We had eventually a weak El Nino form, and that's tended to hinder the development last season, not as much as we had anticipated. This year, well, what's going to happen out there? Well, first of all, an El Nino occurs when the water temperatures are warmer than normal in the tropical Pacific. The reverse, La Nina, is when the waters are cooler than normal. Now, El Nino hinders hurricane development because it generates wind shear across the Atlantic Basin. We have a lot of activity in the western or the eastern Pacific Ocean. We have rising air there. We have sinking air in the Atlantic Basin, but we also have increased westerly winds aloft, which cause wind shear, as we see in the right panel here. And when you get stronger winds aloft than at the surface, then you tend to have the clouds that are disturbances out there in the tropics tilted to the side a little bit. It makes it harder for them to get organized. Hurricanes like to have a stable wind environment with the winds about the same direction and speed at all levels. So when they're not that way, it makes it hard for them to get going. And that's what El Nino does. Well, what are we expecting this year? Well, take a look here at the water temperatures in the Pacific right now. The reddish and orangish colors are much above normal temperatures, all the way from the coast of South America all the way out into the central Pacific, well above normal temperatures. That's a sure sign that El Nino is developing, and it's strengthening out there. It's stronger than it was last year at this time by far, and the signs are that it's going to continue to strengthen as we move into the hurricane season. In fact, the latest forecast now, and the red bars here represent the forecast of El Nino. The red bars now are topping 80%. Last month, we were looking at about 70% chance. Now it's up to 80% all the way through October. I think it's a certainty we're going to be seeing at least a moderate El Nino this year, and perhaps even a little bit stronger than that. And that could be a significant inhibitor toward hurricane development during the 2015 season. We also have to take a look at water temperatures out in the Atlantic Basin. As we look at the water temperatures across the eastern Atlantic, we see that the water temperatures have cooled off considerably. Those blues and those greens now showing up around the Cape Verde Islands. Very, very cool water development. Well, not really cool, but much below normal water temperatures out there in the Atlantic Basin, all the way from Africa to the central Caribbean Sea. two areas that we have above normal water temperatures, the Western Atlantic, north of the Caribbean Sea, off the southeast U.S. coast, as well as in the Gulf of Mexico. So we do have plenty of warmish water there that could support hurricane development. But as for the main development region between Africa and the Caribbean Sea, very, very cool compared to normal. Well, let's take a look back over the last 65 years and see how the water temperatures are progressing. This is the month of March, and this graphic was, the data were put together by Dr. Phil Klotzbach, a friend of mine, and we're looking at warm cycles that typically last about 25 years, cool cycles about 25, 35 years, and the last warm cycle started in 1995. Typically, when the Atlantic heats up, as it started doing in 1995, we don't necessarily have more named storms, but we tend to have more intense hurricane activity, about 4 major hurricanes per season versus about 2 during a cool cycle. But if you look at the latest part of that graphic here, right at the end, you can see that currently, for March anyway, we're way down here, cooler than just about 1990 during the last cool cycle. What's going on? Are we switching back to a multi-decadal cool period in the Atlantic when we have less major hurricane activity? Well, let's look back just a little bit farther than 1950 and see if we can see any patterns in there. Remember, here we are right now where this is the annual Atlantic multi-decadal oscillation, or basically the water temperatures out there in the eastern Atlantic. And you can see that compared to previous warm cycles, yes, it's cool, but back in the last warm cycle, there were 2 periods when the water temperatures were cooler than they are now. And back in the cycle that started in 1878, there was 1 period when the water temperatures suddenly cooled, but they warmed back up, and it was still another 10, 15 years before it progressed to the next cool cycle. So it's a little bit too early to say whether or not this cool period that we're observing now is going to result in a transition to a cool cycle with significantly less major hurricane activity over the coming years. I think it's going to take 2 or 3 or maybe 4 more years before we can definitively say that we've left the warm cycle. My gut is saying that we probably haven't. I think this is a temporary cool spike like we saw a couple of times from 1926 to 1969 and from 1878 to 1900. I think it's temporary, and I think that in another year or 2 we're going to see a return back to more intense hurricanes out there with a warmer Atlantic. But we'll see. We won't be able to know for at least a couple of years. The European model did very, very well last year in predicting activity across the basin. It predicted that the activity would be about 70% of normal, and it turned out to be just about exactly right. Now, the current European model forecast for July through September, we're looking at pressure forecasts across the deep tropics, because where you have higher pressure, you tend to have less hurricane activity. And it's forecasting higher pressures than it was forecasting last year at this time. Very high pressures all the way from Africa to the Gulf of Mexico, mostly between the Caribbean Sea and Africa, where we have that orange in there, very high pressures in that region. That means more sinking air, more dry air. And speaking of dry air, the forecast for rainfall for that same period, July through September, relatively dry from Africa all the way through the Caribbean Sea and into the southwestern Gulf. Not so much dry north of the Caribbean Sea off the southeast U.S. coast. So plenty of dry air in the deep tropics, just as we have seen for the last couple of years. It's going to be continuing. Another tool that we can use to estimate what's going to happen over the coming season is looking at what we call analog years. And an analog year is simply a year in the past that has a similar setup in terms of ocean temperatures in the Atlantic and maybe a similar El Nino or La Nina situation in the Pacific. Something with a similar setup with ocean temperatures and upper level wind flow and steering currents. And from these analog years that we identify, we can perhaps forecast what's going to happen over the coming season, where the storms might develop and where they tend to might be a little bit less frequent. And these are some of the better analog years for 2015. And you can see in most of them featured about 7 to 8 storms, relatively quiet across the Caribbean Sea. You can see the storm tracks there. A lot of activity off the southeast U.S. coast. Not a whole lot of activity in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, my coworker Fred Schmoody has been looking at these analogs with me, and he thinks the best analog for 2015 is not here, but it's 1957. In 1957, there were 8 named storms, 3 hurricanes, 2 major hurricanes, and not much activity at all. In fact, no activity between Africa and the Caribbean Sea. One storm, storm number 4, formed out there and tracked well north and east of the Caribbean Sea, but very quiet in what we call the main development region. The Gulf of Mexico wasn't extremely quiet. About half the storms developed there, and only one hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico, but that was a big one. That was Hurricane Audrey. Category 4 struck the southwest Louisiana coast as a Category 3 hurricane and caused significant damage and loss of life. So we had one significant storm that year in the Gulf of Mexico. That was the only major land impact of 1957. Now, if we look at all of these analog years together and plot the tracks of the storms, a friend of mine, Levi Cohen, plotted a graphic for me that shows where the storms tended to congregate during these analog years. Now, circle those areas in red. And it's the reddish-brown colors here indicated where the track frequencies were higher during these analog years. And you can see north of the Caribbean Sea, definitely track higher. Not much activity. The blue is below normal activity in the Caribbean Sea, but another spike here in the Gulf of Mexico of activity. And a lot of that's probably from 1957. So what's the forecast for this year? Well, let's take a look here, and this is our forecast. We're looking at about 7 to 9 named storms, probably about 8 named storms, 3 or 4 hurricanes, and 1 or 2 intense Category 3, 4, and 5 hurricanes. I think it's going to be very quiet between Africa and the Caribbean Sea. I don't think there's going to be much activity threatening the Lesser Antilles or even the Greater Antilles for that matter. I think that the primary development region looks to be north of the Caribbean Sea. They may develop east of the Caribbean Sea, but I think they'll take a northward track and track out into the open Atlantic. Might be a potential to threaten the East Coast, but I still think that the chances of a significant impact along the U.S. East Coast is a little bit below normal. We have that in blue here on that graphic. But secondarily, we have to watch that Gulf of Mexico. I don't think we're going to see a lot of activity in the Gulf of Mexico, but I do think that with the water temperatures as warm as they are, and El Nino tends to affect more the deep tropics rather than the Gulf of Mexico, we've had some significant impacts across the Gulf Coast during El Nino years like Betsy in 65 or Audrey 57 or Andrew in 1992. So just because it's an El Nino doesn't mean we can't get activity in the Gulf of Mexico. And we see that the analog year suggests that we might have one significant storm in the Gulf. We do have to watch for that. And that's why I have the areas from Texas all the way to southern Florida as closer to normal. It may still be a tad below normal in terms of potential impact, but it's certainly a higher chance there than I think along the East U.S. coast as far as the potential. It's not higher than normal, but it's just pretty much close to normal there across the Gulf Coast. We do have to watch for that close-in development. And the problem with the close-in development is you get very little warning or little heads up from the time it forms to the times it makes landfall. So that you should have all your preparations ready for the start of the season. For the names this year, these are the names we're looking at. Same name list as in 2009, and that year ended with Hurricane Ida in the Gulf of Mexico. Briefly, a hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico as late as November, a rare November hurricane in the Gulf of Mexico. This year, I think we'll probably get down through about the 8th name there, Henri. And I don't think we'll get too much beyond that with only 8 name storm forecasts. We're not going to be seeing those names at the end of the list at all. Everything just points to a very, very quiet season out there. I think we'll have less hurricanes than last year and less activity in general even than last year. And that's a look at the tropics and severe weather. And I turn it back over to Dave, see if any questions.
Hi, Chris. Yes, indeed. We do have some questions. The first question is about the Alaskan high. That's at least partially responsible for the drought out to the west coast, but is it affecting the 2015 hurricane season, and will it make a return for the winter of 2015 and 2016?
Well, Dave, that's something I meant to mention when I was showing that graphic showing the very or relatively warm water. There, it's not warm. I've been on the West Coast and the water's never warm there, but it's above normal. Those above normal temperatures offshore California and Oregon and Washington were a big reason for that high pressure building along the West Coast and causing the abnormally warm and dry conditions across the West Coast. But I think with El Nino strengthening, and we're already seeing signs that the southern storm track is increasing, I think that that high pressure area is breaking down, and that we're going to see a return to more normal conditions there, and probably leading into next winter. I don't think we're going to see the same type of winter on the West Coast next year, because I think that the El Nino would be a good bit stronger. We'll have more of a westerly storm impact by that time with the storm tracking into Southern California.
I know your forecast showed the slide a couple of before this one, before you showed the names, showed the forecast, but could you assess the risk between northerly tracks towards Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama versus a more westerly track to Texas?
Well, I think that given the tracks in the analog seasons, generally the activity that did develop in the Gulf in these similar seasons of the past tracked northward. And that's what I would think. That's why I have the area heightened on the northern Gulf Coast. I extended it all the way down to the lower Texas coast, but really it's more likely the prime area is going to be from the Texas-Louisiana border to the Florida Panhandle for any potential heightened level of impact threat across the northern Gulf Coast. They just tend to move in that direction when they form in the central Gulf of Mexico. We have the same, the rare occasions of one that forms off Louisiana, like Alicia in 1983, another El Nino year that tracked westward into the Houston-Galveston area. And number one, I guess, of 1943. Everybody remembers that one, right? That tracked just about the same track from offshore Louisiana into the upper Texas coast. So but primarily we're looking at the northern Gulf Coast from the Texas-Louisiana border or the upper Texas coast over the Florida Panhandle.
The analog year of 1957, the year my parents were married, by the way, you spent a lot of time talking about 1957. Can you talk more about the other analog years, and why is 1957 so key?
Well, 1957 best matches the what we're seeing out there in terms of general wind flow and steering patterns and water temperatures in the Atlantic and the Pacific. And the other years, well, you look at them, and as I look at these years, 87, 91, 93, and 2014, well, just last year, everybody remembers that year, there weren't a lot of impacts. 1991 featured Bob striking Long Island. I think it was a nearly Category 2 hurricane that struck Long Island area. So it's the only East Coast impact of significance over the end of these analog years. But they weren't very active at all in terms of impacts anywhere in land areas or in terms of number of storms. And everything suggests that this year is going to be a relatively quiet season as far as the number of storms. Of course, if you get hit by that one major hurricane, then you'll consider it not a very quiet season at all.
Another question is about the relationship between the West Coast drought and El Nino. Can you talk about that relationship?
Well, that was kind of unusual. We didn't expect that because we expected El Nino to come in stronger during the last hurricane season and into the winter months. And it remained very, very weak. With a strong El Nino, typically we have low pressure along the West Coast. We tend to have more storminess and a wetter than normal pattern across the U.S. West Coast. And that's certainly not what happened. I think a prime reason for that was the fact that the El Nino just didn't come on as strongly as predicted last summer and fall. And it didn't really come on strongly until just very, very recently in the last few weeks. And I think that's one of the prime reasons for the lack of rainfall and the very warm temperatures on the West Coast.
All right, thank you, Chris. You know, your last slide here has your name on it. It also has our hashtag Storm webinar. I'd like to take just a moment to talk to you about Twitter. You probably think it's the playground of celebrities and there's nothing worthwhile on Twitter. However, all your local offices of emergency management are tweeting. If you have a Twitter account and you've got it on your phone, those emergency areas are specifically pushing emergency information to you. Imagine your family hunkered down avoiding a hurricane, and that information is coming directly to them. So hashtag Storm Webinar is all our information from this particular webinar, but there are bigger issues with Twitter. You can log in, you can get that information pushed to you, and it's a really great tool in moments of severe weather. It's not just about what Beyonce had for breakfast or what Jay-Z said at the whatever award ceremony it was.
Also mention Tropics Watch here.
Oh yes, and Chris's hashtag is handle is at Tropics Watch. So he tweets and treats.
I tweet.
He tricks as well. You can follow him at Tropics Watch on Twitter. So we do use Twitter, and we do enjoy Twitter, and I think you should too. So that'll wrap it up for today. Chris's email, it's a new email at stormgeo.com. So it's chris.hebert@stormgeo.com. Our next webinar has been scheduled for Wednesday, June 10th, 10:30, same time as always. Once again, Chris will be our guest, and the topic will be the ongoing hurricane season. I'll send the invitation to all of you who are currently registered for this presentation. You can check out all the details on our news and events page at stormgeo.com. Also, in the next couple of days, I'll send a follow-up email which will include the link to the recorded version of today's webinar. And don't forget, you can follow StormGeo on LinkedIn, Twitter, Facebook. Use any of these sites for the latest updates and announcements that our webinars and events can bring to you. As a reminder to our clients, you can receive the latest news about potential weather threats as they develop by way of your personalized weather website, which will grant you access to our exclusive videos, forecast models, and alerts. If you're not a client and would like to learn more about how we can enhance your business continuity plans through site-specific weather forecasting and risk mitigation best practices, please contact us by emailing sales.houston@stormgeo.com. On behalf of all of us here at the new StormGeo office in Houston, I'm Dave Gorham, and I'd like to thank you for joining us this morning. We look forward to seeing you at our next webinar, June 10th. Until then, have a safe and productive summer season. Stay cool, stay dry, stay safe. Bye-bye.